well, in just 40 days. Iran shut down 20% of the world's energy supply, rendered the U.S. aircraft carrier strategically obsolete, broke the petrodollar's monopoly in the Persian Gulf, and fractured NATO without winning a single conventional battle. This is not analysis of what might happen. This is a forensic breakdown of what already did. If you're tracking the intelligence traffic between February 28th and April 10th, 2026, one conclusion is inescapable. The global geopolitical architecture did not simply shift. It underwent a catastrophic structural rupture, an absolute paradigm collapse that shattered the 1970s containment model the Western alliance has relied on for decades. Well, what we are going to do in this video is bypass the executive summaries, the press briefings, the curated casualty lists, the spin, and deliver the raw, unabridged breakdown of what the source material actually shows. We are going to cover the complete failure of U.S. and Israeli tactical objectives, the weaponization of the Strait of Hormuz, the chaotic and deeply flawed diplomacy in Islamabad, the fracturing of NATO, and the volatile internal dynamics inside Iran that are still unresolved. This is a lot of ground, but you have to parse it layer by layer to understand the full mechanics of what happened, and more importantly, what it means for what comes next. Let's start with the baseline tactical realities. The U.S. and Israel entered this conflict with a four-pillar ultimatum. This was not a nuanced, diplomatically phased approach. It was a maximalist stance with four explicit demands: regime change in Iran, complete elimination of nuclear enrichment, elimination of long-range ballistic missiles, and the severing of all Iranian support for the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas. If you look at the verified telemetry and on-the-ground intelligence and compare those stated objectives on February 28th to the verifiable reality by April 10th, the success rate across all four pillars was exactly 0%. The regime remained intact. The nuclear infrastructure was not eliminated. The ballistic missiles not only survived, they overwhelmed advanced air defense systems. Now, if you were watching the domestic briefings coming out of Washington during this period, you heard a very different story: claims of massive kinetic victory, casualty lists being read as evidence of strategic success. Reconciling that narrative with a 0% strategic success rate requires understanding a specific and critical failure, the collapse of overhead battle damage assessment, or BDA, in asymmetric warfare. When you rely exclusively on high-altitude drones and satellites without human intelligence on the ground to verify what you're actually looking at, BDA becomes an echo chamber. You see thermal signatures and rubble. You do not know whether you destroyed a sophisticated missile system or an empty shipping crate. Analysts like General Jack Keane promoted a narrative of total destruction based on heavily spoofed overhead BDA. It was, in analytical terms, putting lipstick on a pig, a performance designed to satisfy domestic political demand rather than reflect operational reality, compounding. Trump's social media threat to destroy a civilization in a night was processed by the global south and across Eurasia not as bluster but as an overt nuclear threat. You cannot erase a 2,700-year-old civilization with standard cruise missiles. The global interpretation was clear. And China's response was unprecedented: an explicit warning to Israel that the use of a nuclear weapon would spell the immediate demise of their state. Beijing drew an absolute red line. The combined effect of failed BDA and apocalyptic rhetoric was that the U.S. and Israel isolated themselves globally while simultaneously masking the scale of their tactical failures. Understanding why the kinetic strikes failed to degrade Iran's command and control requires understanding the architecture Iran deliberately built to defeat Western military doctrine. Western doctrine is built around decapitation strikes. You identify and eliminate the central communications hub. You paralyze the organism. Iran studied this doctrine carefully and restructured its entire military architecture specifically to neutralize it. They decentralized into 31 autonomous military districts, each operating with pre-delegated launch authority. The Western assumption is that severing primary command and control nodes in Tehran would cause peripheral military units to freeze, to hold fire, and await orders to avoid friendly fire. That assumption is wrong. These 31 districts do not wait for orders. If they lose contact with the Supreme National Security Council, that loss of signal is mathematically coded as an authorization to attack. Hitting the capital does not kill the snake. Well, it spawns 31 highly armed autonomous entities, each of which must be suppressed simultaneously, with no central authority remaining to call a ceasefire. When U.S. forces attempted a deeper penetration, the results were catastrophic. The Isfahan operation, a complex attempted landing, produced losses that White House sources described as an epic failure. 12 aircraft lost within hours, including F-35s, F-15s, F-16s, Chinooks, and Blackhawks. Over $500 million in hardware eliminated. Well, the question of how a legacy air defense network defeats fifth-generation stealth fighters is answered not by any single capability, but by a compounding cascade. Advanced GPS spoofing, radar jamming, and saturation fire operating in concert, throwing aircraft into simultaneous cognitive and kinetic overload. The architecture held, the doctrine failed with the aerospace domain neutralized. Iran transitioned the battlefield completely from kinetic to economic. And this is where the real strategic genius of the Iranian response becomes visible. The Strait of Hormuz handles roughly 20% of global oil and 20% of global natural gas. It is, without hyperbole, the jugular of the global energy system. The closure was achieved not primarily through physical force, but through the weaponization of financial infrastructure, specifically the insurance mechanism. You do not need to sink ships to close the strait. You need to threaten the actuaries. The mere credible threat of asymmetric drone strikes was sufficient for London underwriters to declare the strait an exclusion zone, no coverage available for vessels transiting the waterway, and without insurance, you cannot move a $300 million tanker, regardless of what the U.S. Navy promises in terms of escort. It is the equivalent of building a 10-lane highway and placing a sniper in the surrounding hills. The road exists. No one is going to use it. Daily traffic through the strait dropped from over 100 ships to between 4 and 12, a total economic chokehold achieved primarily through institutional and financial pressure rather than kinetic force. The primary energy spike was only the beginning. The secondary cascades were where the true systemic damage manifested. Qatar's natural gas exports became trapped inside the Gulf. Natural gas is not only a fuel, it is a chemical feedstock. The immediate consequence was a critical global shortage of helium, a substance essential for computer chip manufacturing. The tech supply chain froze, but the human cost extended far beyond technology markets. The blockade halted the production of sulfuric acid and urea being the base compound for artificial fertilizers. Without urea, fertilizer markets collapse. Missed the planting window and agricultural yields dropped by half. The projected consequence was famine for tens to hundreds of millions of people across the global south and sub-Saharan Africa, driven by a maritime blockade in the Persian Gulf. The causal chain is long but structurally sound. While the world scrambled for resources, Iran established the toll booth. Limited vessel passage was permitted under specific conditions and with one absolute non-negotiable requirement. No U.S. dollars payment processed exclusively in yuan, entirely through SIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system, bypassing SWIFT completely. This was a direct operational attack on petrodollar hegemony. Well, even South Korea, one of America's most reliable Pacific allies, sent a special envoy to break the boycott and pay the toll in yuan. It was not a political statement, it was economic survival. The financial blowback hit the United States domestically with equal force. Intelligence indicates deep institutional corruption. A White House insider placed a $1 billion bet on Brent crude, declining based on foreknowledge of Trump's ceasefire announcement. France began repatriating its sovereign gold from U.S. custody. Japan started dumping U.S. treasuries. The architecture of dollar supremacy, built across decades, began visibly cracking within weeks. Well, if you are finding this analysis valuable, the kind of structured, unfiltered breakdown that goes beyond headlines, consider subscribing to Multipolar Realities. This channel exists precisely to document these shifts as they happen. President Trump imposed an arbitrary 8 p.m. deadline for a ceasefire, a decision that created structural panic across the delegation. The team dispatched to Islamabad consisted of Vice President J.D. Vance, Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner. Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif served as mediator, not as architect, but as a messenger between parties. Well, the Iranian foreign minister had explicitly requested that Witkoff and Kushner not be included in the negotiations. The U.S. sent them anyway. It represents a fundamental failure of statecraft, the prioritization of optics over protocol during an active global crisis. That failure of personnel selection cascaded into a failure of documentation. The original 10-point ceasefire plan was written in Farsi. The U.S. delegation worked from an English translation containing deliberate ambiguities. The most operationally consequential of those ambiguities became what analysts are calling the Lebanon loophole. Iran's Farsi text explicitly mandated a ceasefire across all active fronts, including Lebanon. Well, the U.S. position, communicated publicly through figures including Caroline Leavitt, was that Lebanon was not included. Israel moved immediately, resuming bombardment of Beirut, killing hundreds of civilians per day, striking 6 separate maternity hospitals. The central analytical question, whether the U.S. intentionally constructed that ambiguity to provide Netanyahu political cover, or whether the Trump administration was simply unable to restrain Israeli military action, is probably not a binary. The available evidence suggests both dynamics were operating simultaneously. The ceasefire simultaneously detonated a political crisis inside Iran. Javad Zarif published an op-ed in Foreign Affairs that analyst Pepe Escobar characterized as a surrender manifesto. Well, the reformist diplomatic wing was projecting appeasement, while the military, which had just executed 40 days of asymmetric warfare, held all the strategic cards. The contrast with the hardline posture of the Supreme National Security Council was stark and destabilizing. The OSINT indicators of an intentionally ambiguous ceasefire text are identifiable in retrospect. Rapid, unsanctioned kinetic action by a proxy immediately following the signing, combined with contradictory official narratives emerging simultaneously from both capitals. Both indicators were present and visible in real time. Well, the geopolitical fallout of the tactical and diplomatic failures produced a consequence that will define the next decade of international relations: the fracturing of the transatlantic security architecture. The Suez moment comparison is structurally precise. In 1956, Britain discovered that its projection of military and economic power was a fiction exposed in a single crisis. In 2026, the United States is undergoing the equivalent revelation, specifically in West Asia. The cornerstone of American power projection, the aircraft carrier strike group, has been rendered functionally obsolete in this theater. The operative metric is the 1,000-mile line. Any carrier that comes within 1,000 miles of the Iranian coastline is vulnerable to drone swarms and hypersonic missile systems. General Van Riper demonstrated this vulnerability theoretically during the 2002 Millennium Challenge war game. It is now empirical battlefield reality. Iran's strategic declaration is explicit: security for all or security for none, prosperity for all or prosperity for none. They are not merely defending their own interests. They are unilaterally establishing the terms of a new security architecture across the Eurasian landmass. The response inside NATO was one of rapid visible fragmentation. Trump assigned blame to European allies for failing to contribute to Strait of Hormuz operations. Marco Rubio openly discussed withdrawing 100,000 U.S. troops from the European theater. While NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte was publicly mocked at the Bilderberg meeting at the Salamander Hotel. The institutional disrespect was unmistakable. European leaders, meanwhile, were confronting an energy reality that overrode alliance loyalty. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron pivoted decisively, publicly siding with Iran on the ceasefire translation, explicitly supporting Lebanon's inclusion in order to secure their own energy supply chains and protect domestic utility infrastructure from the consequences of Washington's erratic decision-making. The implications extend beyond Europe. Watching NATO fracture in real time over energy access forces Seoul and Tokyo to draw their own conclusions about the reliability of the U.S. security umbrella. Well, the result is a quiet but consequential push by both South Korea and Japan toward independent strategic accommodations, a direct downstream consequence of U.S. conventional overmatch, failing in the Persian Gulf. To understand where this goes next, you have to understand the internal dynamics inside Iran, because Iran is not a monolith, and the tension between its diplomatic and military wings is both politically explosive and strategically consequential. The assassination of Sayyid Ali Khamenei was calculated to collapse the regime from within. It produced the opposite result. The population mobilized completely. The street became the military apparatus. Ordinary citizens absorbed kinetic strikes and sustained the decentralized war effort for 40 days. Well, the depth of that collective sacrifice created enormous resentment. When the ceasefire was announced, because the diplomatic establishment negotiated a top-down agreement without consulting the population, that had actually bled for the outcome. When the Lebanon loophole became public knowledge, mass protests erupted. The chant was unambiguous. A ceasefire that failed to protect Lebanon was treason. General Tangiri has emerged as the embodiment of the military's grassroots legitimacy, popular not only for his command performance during the war, but for his documented record of combating illegal Chinese trawling vessels and personally funding poverty alleviation in the South. He represents a form of power that the diplomatic establishment cannot match or co-opt. The targeted assassinations of Kamal Karazi, his wife, and Said Majid Musavi further cemented street loyalty to the military apparatus. The long historical arc here is striking. In 2015, a BBC documentary by Hossein Bastani openly mocked Ayatollah Khamenei's stated vision of Iran becoming a top 3 global economy, calling it a parallel universe. With Iranian-operated toll booths in the Strait of Hormuz now generating tens of billions in yuan entirely outside the Western financial architecture, that parallel universe is measurably arriving. The diplomatic corps is attempting to operate within a 20th century framework of negotiated compromise. The military and the street have already moved Iran into a 21st century multipolar reality. The Iranian street's demands are not subtle. They call for the total expulsion of U.S. influence from the Persian Gulf and the complete dismantling of UAE and Bahraini Israeli infrastructure in the region. Any diplomat who offers a concession below that threshold faces immediate domestic characterization as a traitor. This is a structural constraint that makes conventional diplomatic resolution effectively impossible. The mobilized populace does not hold the diplomats politically accountable for failure. It holds them criminally accountable for compromise, synthesizing the full 40 days into a single strategic conclusion. The picture is this. The United States and Israel entered this conflict seeking a tactical decapitation of an adversary. Iran absorbed that attempt and responded with something the coalition's doctrine had no answer for: asymmetric economic asphyxiation. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the elimination of the dollar's monopoly in Persian Gulf energy trade, the fracturing of the NATO alliance, the functional obsolescence of the U.S. carrier in the regional theater. These are not outcomes of a war that America lost on the battlefield. They are the outcomes of a war in which the battlefield itself was redefined by the side that understood the asymmetry first: the petrodollar architecture, the insurance-based financial leverage, the carrier-centered power projection model. All of it was tested simultaneously against a decentralized, pre-delegated, economically weaponized adversary. And the stress test revealed structural failures that decades of military spending had obscured. Here's the final analytical provocation. You have been tracking the troop movements, the spoofed BDA, the mistranslated ceasefire documents, the chaotic diplomatic flights into Islamabad. Step back and consider the broader implication. The playbook has now been written. It has been tested. It has been validated against the most powerful military alliance in history, and it worked. If a single regional power armed with asymmetric drone capability and geographic control over a maritime choke point can permanently alter the global financial architecture and fracture a transatlantic alliance in 40 days, the question is not whether this methodology will be used again. The question is where, by whom, and how soon. The South China Sea is not an abstract possibility. It is the next analytical frame. That is what you need to be tracking. This has been multipolar realities. We exist to document the structural shifts in global power as they happen, not through the lens of any single capital's narrative, but through the unfiltered weight of the evidence. The world is not becoming less complex. It is becoming less unipolar. And understanding the mechanics of that transition precisely, rigorously, without ideological distortion, is the work of this channel. If this breakdown was useful, subscribe. The next phase of this story is already unfolding.